Good morning, friends. Thanks for joining me for another of our Unfolding the Word times together. We've been in the book of Genesis in recent weeks, looking at chapters 3 to 11. In the last several days, we've been looking at chapter 7, the end of chapter 6, looking at the actual implementation of the judgment of the flood. Today, I'd like to read the last verse of the 7th chapter and the first verse of the 8th. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. And God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him on the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. You remember, the flood became the expression of God's judgment and accountability upon mankind that generally, apart from Noah, by the 10th generation following Adam and Eve, was in rebellion against him. And that rebellion against him had led to sin-controlled lives that were corrupting them as individuals, but also corrupting society. And society, beyond being corrupt, had become violent. God sent a judgment, a universal judgment, a universal flood that came upon the world and destroyed all the living creatures on it. Noah stood as a light in his generation, trusting God, calling upon the name of the Lord, coming to God God's way, and choosing to walk with God. And God set him aside, had him carry out the task of building the ark, and then he and his family and the animals came into the ark. The ark was closed by God, and judgment fell. Now, chapter 8, as we're getting into it today, marks a transition into a new era. In a way, we could look at it as a new beginning and have an opportunity to see, listen, was this dramatic worldwide expression of God's judgment enough to shake some sense into mankind? Would having a godly father and husband who loved the Lord, who decided to walk with God and was obedient unto him, would that presence have enough of an influence on the children and on the subsequent generations to ensure that the people would continue to call upon the name of the Lord? Great questions, and questions that we're going to see answered as we move forward into our study. But today I particularly want to focus in on verse 1. I'm going to read it to you again out of chapter 8. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. Notice here, in the midst of all of this disastrous flood, the expression of God's judgment upon the world, upon mankind, this interesting phrase arises, but God remembered Noah. Imagine for a moment what the situation was for Noah. We had talked yesterday about the fact that Noah was in the ark with his family for over a year and 10 days before he could finally come out of the ark. Think what it was like floating around in that ark, unable to stop. Certainly the terrible, terrible storms and breaking up of the deeps would have just tossed that ark back and forth. And I'm a person who gets seasick, and I can just imagine what it must have been like, until such time as the waters, even if they were rising, tended to settle a little bit in terms of the choppiness and waviness. The ark was not built with rudder controls. There was nowhere to land, even if you'd have had a rudder. You had no way to know, if you were in Noah's case, how long the crisis was going to arise. You knew it was going to be 40 days and 40 nights of rain, but you did not know how much further beyond that this consequence of the flood would be seen. As the crisis of the flood continued, day by day, week by week, once the rain stopped, the weeks continued to go and the months continued to go as the waters continued to rise. You know, in that context, it would be very reasonable for Noah, his wife, his sons, their wives, to have the thought occur to them, has God forgotten me? God was active agent, giving me guidance, leading into this judgment upon mankind. He told us how to build the ark. He put us in. He shut us in. But it's been a long time since we've heard from God. It's been a long time that we've been caught up in the crisis. A long time before we've seen resolution. Has God forgotten me? You and I have had those thoughts in our own crises, especially those crises that continue on, not just day by day, and not even week by week, but month by month by month, and in some cases, year by year. And I think that's why here at the very beginning of the scriptures in the book of Genesis, we encounter this very precious verse in this precious picture of God. God remembered Noah. And of course, by implication, remembered his family as well. Now, what does it mean that God remembered Noah? Well, let's begin with what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that God had forgotten about Noah, meaning God was so distracted with all of the judgment and all of the other business of the universe that he had forgotten about Noah. He was not on the front burner anymore, so he had forgotten about Noah. Or that God, as a result, was just simply too busy to know, too busy to care, too busy to provide. No, that's not what it means. In fact, the scripture goes on and builds out of Genesis into the rest of the word, and it underscores for us the omniscience of God, that term that we use to describe the fact that God knows everything all the time. So he knows everything there is to know. He knows everything there is to know everywhere there is to know it. So when it says God remembered Noah, it doesn't mean that somehow Noah had been off his mind and now it came back into his mind. So if that's not what it means, what does it mean? What remembering Noah means, that phrase, is that God's timing was now right to act on the promise he had given to Noah. He had made promises to Noah. Now was the time to see the fulfillment of those promises. Remembered means to act upon in the way it's used in this context. Now, by the way, another picture of that meaning of this word can be found in 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, it talks about the birth of Samuel, the prophet, the judge, and how God brought about this miracle with his mother and made the promise to her that she, in response to her fervent prayer, that she would have this child come. In verse 19 and 20 of that first chapter of Samuel, it says this: they rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord, and then they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. Do you see the use of the word remembered about God? What was happening? God had made a promise to her that he would give this son. And he remembered the promise, meaning at the fullness of time, at the right point in time, he let the child be conceived and then born. God remembers when he acts upon and fulfills a promise he has made. He remembers his promises to you. He remembers you when he acts upon, in the fullness of time, the promise that he's made to you. It never means that you've been off God's mind. It never means that he has just now begun to think about you. As Jesus told us in the Sermon on the Mount, even the hairs of our head are numbered. The Lord knows when a sparrow falls. No, God has not forgotten you in the midst of your crisis any more than he forgot Noah in the midst of his. But the timing had come together so that in response to that timing of God, it was time to act, and so he did it. Is that how you see God? Again, part of the purpose of the scriptures is to correct our idolatrous understandings of God and replace them with a true picture of the God who is there. The fact of the matter is, God always knows what's going on. And it answers the fear that's in my life and in your life that maybe God has forgotten us in the midst of the crisis that we're facing. God always knows your situation, but he has a definite time frame in which his promises will be fulfilled. and we need to trust him about that. We don't need to alert God to our circumstance, but we do need to cast our circumstance upon him. Let's not believe he's ever forgotten. He's holding tight in understanding. Now, when we gather together tomorrow, Lord willing, we're going to see exactly how God remembered. In other words, what actions did God begin to implement here in the 8th chapter in response to the promise that had been made to Noah and his family. So join me as we do that, and keep reminding yourself on this day, God remembers and knows absolutely what you're facing. And he has a perfect time in which he will remember in the terms of fulfilling the promise he has made. God bless.